Hello, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we travel far north, into the cold, wind-bitten edges of Europe, where the long, dark winters cloaked the land in silence, and survival itself became a ritual. You may have heard of the Vikings. Not the warriors of silver-screen sagas, not the endless raiders, nor the conquerors with horned helmets, because, by the way, they never wore those. Tonight, we will set aside the myth of the Viking hero. Instead, we'll walk slowly and quietly through the longhouses and the ice-covered fields. We'll feel the rough wool against our skin, the chill seeping through the door cracks, and the weight of another winter settling in. We'll begin by immersing ourselves in the everyday rhythm of life for an ordinary Norse farmer in the harshest month of the year. Then we'll follow one of the last true Vikings, Harald Hardrada, on a long, winding journey from the frost-bitten fjords to the heated intrigue of Constantinople and finally to his dramatic fall in England. After that, we'll take a gentle walk through one of the most fascinating archaeological discoveries in Viking history, the Oseberg ship burial. And finally, we'll sit quietly inside the candlelit halls of the Norse elite, where feasts were more than indulgence. They were power, politics, and silent threats wrapped in songs and mead. So take a deep breath, settle into your blankets, and imagine a snow-covered land lit only by oil lamps and the occasional flicker of the northern lights. This is your quiet journey through the Norse winter. Let's begin. Imagine yourself in a wooden longhouse. It is February, deep in the Viking winter, and the world outside is still and white. Snow rests heavily on the roof above, and the wind whispers through the wooden walls like an old god sighing. The days are short, barely light at all, and the nights are endless, black as tar and eerily silent. You are a farmer. Not a warrior, not a seafarer, not one of the sagas. You don't carry an axe. You carry a shovel, a dull knife, and a bundle of splintered firewood. Your family's survival depends not on glory or gold, but on dried fish, frozen grain, and whether the goats survive the night. The longhouse is shared not just with your family, but with your animals. Chickens roost in the rafters. A sick sheep coughs gently near the hearth. The air smells of smoke, sour hay, and damp wool. There is no privacy, only closeness. Warmth is life. The livestock live indoors not by choice, but necessity. They provide heat and perhaps, if they live through the winter, milk or meat. Your clothes are layers of rough, undyed wool. They itch against your skin. Beneath them, linen if you're lucky. No modern insulation, no running water, no windows to let in the light, only slits in the timber and the dim glow of a dying fire. Outside, the ground is iron-hard. The fields are dead, silent under their blanket of frost. You do not farm in February. Instead, you mend tools. You repair broken roof beams. You untangle nets, sharpen blades. There is always something broken, always something hungry. The food is the same each day. Salted fish, flat barley bread baked weeks ago and gone tough as bark, maybe dried berries if any were left from autumn's meager harvest. You chew slowly, not because of the flavor, but to stretch it out. Your children complain of cold. Your partner stares quietly at the fire. Even talking feels like too much effort. The smoke from the hearth clings to everything: hair, blankets, breath. Time passes slowly. The sun does not rise until late morning, and it sets again just hours later. The darkness presses in on all sides. You light oil lamps made of carved stone, fueled by animal fat. They sputter and hiss, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sometimes you sit in the dark and listen, not for danger, but for the stillness itself, the creak of timber, the shifting of a restless goat, the occasional snore, or the far-off crack of something settling under the ice. Illness is a quiet dread. There are no doctors, only a wise woman, a handful of herbs, and the hope that fever doesn't take hold. Infections linger. Coughs become deeper. No one talks about it much, but everyone knows what it could mean. You pass the time telling stories, not of monsters or raiders, but of past harvests, of family gone, of winters survived. These stories aren't grand, they are grounding, anchoring. Memory is warmth in a time of cold. February is the month you endure, the last stretch before hope stirs again in spring, but the sun still feels distant and the snow is heavy. Your muscles ache from chopping wood. Your knuckles crack and bleed. The river is frozen. The chickens are quiet. The days feel the same. Still, you rise. You feed the animals. You break the ice from their troughs. You carry firewood. You check the smoked fish hanging near the roof. You pray to gods who may not be listening, or perhaps who simply enjoy silence. This is Viking life for the many, the unnamed, the forgotten, not warriors in shining mail, but quiet people wrapped in furs, sitting in the dark, waiting for the thaw. And as another endless night begins, you add another log to the fire, lean back against the rough wood, and wait. The rhythm of survival continues. Now that we've sat in the still quiet of a Viking farmer's February, let us drift gently from the snow-covered longhouse to the wide, wind-beaten sea. Because while most Norsemen spent their lives rooted in frozen fields and smoky huts, there were a rare few who crossed empires, men whose footsteps echoed across both frost and sand. One of them was Harald Sigurdsson. But history would remember him as Harald Hardrada, meaning hard ruler. He was not born in a palace. He was born in 1015 in a land of mountains and fjords, just a boy when his older half-brother Olaf tried to reclaim the Norwegian throne and failed. At only 15 years old, Harald followed Olaf into battle and watched him fall at the Battle of Stiklestad. It should have ended there, a teenager broken in a failed rebellion. But Harald did not die. Instead, he fled. And from there, his journey began. Not as a king, but as an exile with a sword and a will of iron. A warrior abroad. Imagine Harald now, barely more than a boy, crossing the jagged ridgelines of Scandinavia into Sweden, then further still, arriving in the vast and mysterious realm of the Russ, a land of rivers and pine where Norse traders had long set up stations. He stayed briefly, learning, growing taller, stronger, and then east again, all the way to Constantinople. To the Byzantines, he was Araltes, a foreigner with a blade and ambition. He joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit of Viking mercenaries sworn to the Eastern Roman Emperor. This was no quaint posting. These men guarded the palace itself and waged war across the empire's distant edges. And Harald was more than a guard. He became a commander. A storm of a man who fought in Sicily, possibly in North Africa, and against the Bulgars in the Balkans. Legend says he fought in 18 battles during his time in Byzantine service. It is difficult to say which stories are true. Byzantine records are silent in places, but the Norse sagas tell of a man who became wealthy, respected, and, eventually, impatient. He left Constantinople under murky circumstances. Some say he escaped with a hoard of gold, hiding it in barrels marked as wine. Others say he left in anger after a love affair soured or his ambitions were curbed. Whatever the reason, by the early 1040s, Harald returned north, no longer a young exile, but a man who had seen the courts of emperors, the deserts of Sicily, and the blood of many. The return and the crown Harald didn't come home quietly. He allied with a Danish king, Svein Estridsson, and raided the coasts of Denmark and Norway until a shaky peace was struck with King Magnus, the current Norwegian ruler, and ironically, Harald's nephew. Magnus offered Harald half the kingdom, an uneasy sharing of power, but Harald was not made for compromise. By 1047, Magnus was dead and Harald became king of Norway. But his rule was complicated. He centralized power, he cracked down on regional lords, he taxed heavily. Many feared him, some hated him, but few doubted his strength. And yet, one ambition remained. England. Stamford Bridge, the last saga. The English crown had long been a temptation. So in 1066, at the age of 51, already a veteran of decades of battle, Harald Hardrada launched an invasion of England. He sailed with hundreds of ships, accompanied by Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's king. They landed near the river Humber. They won an initial battle at Fulford, but days later they marched to Stamford Bridge, unarmored, confident. It was there that King Harald Godwinson, Tostig's own brother, arrived with his army. And it was there, on the banks of a quiet Yorkshire river, that the Viking age met its twilight. Harald fought bravely, they say, but he died there. An arrow to the throat, most sources say. His great army shattered. The dream of a Norse England vanished like steam from morning frost. Out of the hundreds of ships that had come, only a handful returned to Norway. Harald Hardrada was gone, and many historians agree. With his death ended the Viking era of expansion. What followed was not glory, but quiet absorption into medieval Europe. Kings with crosses, not axes, a lasting echo, but Harald's legend endured, not just as a warrior, but as a symbol. He was the last of the old kind, the sword-wielding, sea-crossing kings who came from smoke and saga. And tonight, as you rest deeper into your blankets, think of him not in battle, but sailing silently at night, under unfamiliar stars, across a dark sea. A man from the fjords, with gold in his beard, salt on his skin, and history behind him. Sleep comes slowly to those who live beneath long winters and longer nights. And in the Viking world, death was not a quiet passing, but a voyage. A transition from this cold, hard life into another realm, one just as real in the minds of the Norse as the soil beneath their feet. Tonight, we gently drift from the world of battles and kings to something quieter, yet in many ways even more profound. We are stepping into the Oseberg ship burial, a vessel not meant for the sea, but for eternity, a discovery. Beneath a hill, in 1904, a farmer digging in a mound near the Fjord in southern Norway unearthed something strange. Wooden planks, rich carvings, iron nails rusted but still purposeful. Archaeologists soon arrived, and what they uncovered became one of the most astonishing Viking Age discoveries in history. Beneath the earthen mound lay a full-sized wooden ship, nearly 70 feet long. Its prow rose like a serpent's neck, its sides etched with elaborate curling motifs, dragons, vines, flowing forms that seemed to undulate even when still. It had not sailed across water. Instead, it had been drawn ashore and buried. Inside it, the remains of two women, one aged around 80, the other possibly in her 50s. Their identities, even now, are debated. Were they queens, priestesses? One possibility is that the elder woman was a Völva, a seeress, a figure of spiritual and social power in Norse society. Another theory, that they were mother and daughter, or a ruler and her handmaiden. But whatever their exact roles, one thing is clear: they were revered. The ship as a grave, imagine it now, as it was over 1,000 years ago. The ship resting in a shallow trench, the mast removed. A wooden burial chamber built into its center, almost like a small cabin. Within it, a raised bed covered in fine cloth, animal pelts, wooden buckets filled with food and drink, dozens of carved wooden chests and carts, perhaps containing clothing, tools, and household items. There were richly decorated sleds, intricate animal head posts, each one slightly different, as though watching the burial with silent wooden eyes. There were the bones of horses, oxen. They were real and they were sacrificed, not with gore or spectacle, but as part of a deeply held belief system that those passing into the next world would need companions, transport, provisions. And just as a Viking would not sail alone in life, so too in death. They would go surrounded by what they needed to begin their final voyage. The mystery of the women. And yet the burial leaves us with questions. There was no treasure, no swords, no jewels, no gold. Many scholars believe the tomb was looted centuries before its modern discovery, perhaps in the medieval period. If so, what was taken? What was left behind? More curiously, the bones of the two women were damaged and scattered. Only fragments remained. Some believe this was the work of grave robbers. Others wonder if it reflects a funerary practice we no longer understand. Something ritual, something symbolic. And who truly were these women? The elder showed signs of disease, possibly cancer. She walked with difficulty, but she was buried in grandeur. A testament, perhaps, to the respect afforded to age and wisdom in Norse society. And so their identities remain lost, but their presence, even in bone, still commands awe. A still voyage. Unlike most Viking ships, the Oseberg vessel never touched waves. It was never meant to. It sailed instead through earth and time. Today, it rests in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo. Its shape painstakingly reconstructed, its carvings darkened by age. But when you look at it, you feel something. Not grandeur, not power, but reverence. The ship is silent, and yet it speaks. Of a culture that saw death not as an ending, but a crossing. Of a people who buried their dead with both solemnity and splendor. And as you drift now deeper into stillness, imagine standing at the edge of that burial mound, long before its discovery. Just the gentle wind, and beneath your feet, the outline of a ship sleeping in the soil, waiting for a dawn that would never come. As we close our journey tonight, we step away from the frostbitten farms and silent burial ships and into the warm, smoky glow of a Viking Jarl's longhouse. The air inside is thick with the scent of pine smoke and roasted meat, dimly lit by flickering torchlight and the steady crackle of a central fire. This is not merely a meal. It is a ritual of power, a theater of politics where every seat taken, every toast given, and every song sung is a calculated move. The Jarl sits in his high seat at the far end of the timber hall, slightly elevated, flanked by his closest allies. The great table stretches out before him, lined with wooden bowls of barley stew and pitchers of strong, honeyed mead. Guests arrive not just to eat, but to be seen. In Viking society, a feast was more than hospitality. It was a declaration of strength and status. Hosting such a gathering proved a man's wealth and influence, and receiving an invitation meant you had a place in the web of alliances. Servants moved quietly between the benches, pouring drinks and laying out platters of smoked fish and bread, while skalds, the Norse poets, rise to recite verses praising the host and subtly critiquing his rivals. These songs matter. They build legacies. A well-placed line could elevate a warrior's name or bury it. As the firelight flickers over carved beams and decorated shields mounted along the walls, the feast gains momentum. Drinking horns are passed and toasts are made in ritual order, first to the gods, then to distant kings, and finally to the host himself. With every sip of mead, bonds are reinforced, grudges surface, and oaths are quietly sworn. Amid laughter and low conversations, alliances shift. Some warriors are rewarded with a better seat than last season, signaling their rising favor. Others watch in silence, calculating. Even silence is part of the game. And while the men toast and boast, it is often the women, especially the Jarl's wife, who wield a subtler power. She moves through the hall with poise, pouring drinks, yes, but also guiding the social rhythm. She sees who meets whose eyes, who is ignored, who drinks too much. In the sagas, women of the hall often shape outcomes just as deftly as swords on the battlefield, nudging alliances into place, cooling tensions before they spark, or quietly shifting the future with a single word. This feast is a performance of wealth and generosity, but also a strategic battleground. Every guest understands that what happens here tonight will echo tomorrow in trade decisions, in whispered agreements, in marriages arranged or rescinded. As the night deepens, the atmosphere shifts. Songs grow slower, the fire burns lower. Some guests drift to sleep on benches, cloaks pulled tight against the draft. Others linger, speaking softly under the cover of dim torchlight. The Jarl watches from his high seat, his gaze steady. He has noted everything: who drank with whom, who kept quiet, who smiled too much. Come morning, he may act on these quiet observations, and no one will tie it back to the seating chart or a single toast withheld. And yet, for all the layers of strategy, there is comfort in this place too. The warmth of shared food, the glow of fire against cold walls, the rhythm of boots on timber. The longhouse, for all its politics, was also a sanctuary, a place to gather, remember, and endure together through the long, dark winter. Most Norse folk would never sit at a Jarl's table, but they heard stories of these feasts. The tales echoed across villages, carried in the songs of skalds and the whispers of merchants. They shaped the myth of the powerful, those who ruled not just through blade and shield, but through roasted meat and well-timed praise. And now, as the last horn is emptied and the fire settles into soft embers, the longhouse quiets. The feast, like the winter, fades slowly. Outside, snow crunches softly under booted feet, and the wind begins its low, steady song through the trees. Inside, the Jarl's power lingers, not in gold, not in war, but in memory, in reputation, in the silence that follows the last toast. As we leave behind the Jarl's feast and the glow of firelight, we move deeper into the mental world of the Norse, into a landscape shaped not just by winter or warfare, but by an ever-present spiritual tapestry of gods, omens, and unseen forces. To live as a Viking was to live surrounded by belief. The gods were not distant, abstract beings, but active participants in daily life. Every illness, every unexpected storm, every failed harvest was not simply misfortune. It was a message, a punishment, or a test. You might begin your morning with a whispered offering to Thor for strength, or leave a carved token by the hearth to ward off the spirit of a restless ancestor. It was not just about devotion, but survival. The world was understood through signs: a raven flying westward, a sudden chill in the air, or the way the bones cracked in the fire. These things mattered. They guided choices, reinforced community, and offered fragile explanations in a harsh, unpredictable world. Odin, in particular, cast a long and complicated shadow over Viking consciousness. He was not simply a wise god or a warlord. He was a wanderer, a manipulator, a figure of both knowledge and dread. Farmers might fear him, warriors might revere him, and poets might dream of his gifts. To invoke him was to ask for vision, but risk madness. Sacrifices in his name, whether a few drops of blood or something far more serious, were meant to pierce the veil between the known and the unknown. And while not every family could afford grand rituals or temple offerings, belief seeped into the smallest acts. Children were taught old sayings and short prayers. Old women, often half feared and half respected, were the keepers of folk rituals and weather wisdom. Even a lowly herder might mutter a charm into the snow as he walked home beneath a heavy sky, hoping to keep wolves and darker things at bay. Death, too, was never final in Norse thought. The dead lingered watching from beyond. Their presence was felt in the wind against the roof, in dreams that stayed too long, in footsteps that creaked where none should be. Grave goods weren't simply offerings of respect. They were tools for use in another world: a comb, a knife, a bit of food. These were meant to comfort, to equip, or perhaps to appease. And not all spirits were kind. Draugr, restless, dead. Things were feared in isolated homes and long, lonely winters. To disrespect the dead, or bury them without proper rites, was to risk haunting. Even the sagas, so full of heroes and raiders, pause often to speak of portents and dreams, of strange animals that speak, of skies that bleed color, of voices from trees. It was not fantasy. It was a lived world, seen through different eyes, and through it all, the rhythm of belief offered comfort as much as fear. Festivals like Yule brought warmth, storytelling, and shared rituals meant to bless the household. Sacred groves and standing stones marked places where the veil was thinner. Certain foods, brewed drinks, or carvings held protective power. These things anchored people, giving structure to a life that otherwise tilted easily into hunger, cold, and war. And so, beneath the harshness of Viking winters, beneath the noise of axes and the grind of farming, there lay a quiet current of faith, layered with anxiety, hope, and the endless desire to understand a world that rarely explained itself. You did not believe in the gods so much as you breathed them. You did not fear the spirits because you were superstitious. You feared them because you had seen too many things that couldn't be explained. And so, night after night, candles were lit, charms were spoken, and stories were told, not only to remember, but to endure. As we drift from the quiet rhythms of Viking spirituality, imagine instead the soft creaking of a wooden hull slicing through icy waters. The wind is cold and constant, pressing against the heavy wool of your cloak as your longship glides across the grey surface of the sea. You are not a warrior setting out for conquest, but a merchant, perhaps even a crew hand on one of the many trade routes that stitch together the Norse world. Though often remembered for raids, the Vikings were also master traders. Their ships not only bringing plunder but amber, walrus ivory, iron tools and finely worked textiles across thousands of miles. In winter, these routes slowed or froze altogether, but preparations never ceased. Goods were stored, repaired, counted and bargained over by firelight. In the warmer months, journeys extended from the misty coasts of Ireland to the glittering domes of Constantinople. But in winter, the world shrank again. Ice closed ports, and overland routes became treacherous. And yet even frozen rivers might become trade highways, navigable by sled or ski. Markets in Viking settlements were filled with foreign scents and languages. Frankish glass beads, Arabic silver coins, Byzantine silks, and even spices made their way north, carried by hands that passed through both danger and diplomacy. You might have bartered a pelt for soapstone or a bit of honey for a carved amulet. We picture Viking traders as rugged and stern, but many were keen negotiators, multilingual and deeply networked. For every sword sold to a foreign kingdom, there were baskets of fish, bolts of homespun wool, or barrels of salted herring loaded onto creaking carts. In places like Hedeby or Birka, trade centers buzzed with gossip and rumor, with the scent of tallow, pine resin, and sea salt clinging to every surface. But winter still governed it all. It was a time of counting coin, repairing ships, and dreaming of distant ports under warmer skies. The success of Norse commerce often depended not only on bravery, but on memory. Routes were memorized, alliances kept through generations, and names of safe harbors, dangerous shoals, fair merchants were passed from father to son. Storms could end a voyage, ice could trap a fleet, but a sharp mind could preserve a family's fortune. In the long, dark months, traders and sailors gathered to tell stories, not of gods or spirits this time, but of faraway bazaars and cities that never slept. Some may have even converted to foreign religions along the way, adopting the customs of those they traded with. But back home, the rhythm remained rooted in winter. Accounts had to be settled, goods tallied, journeys planned. Around the thaw, to be a Norse trader was to be part of a world much larger than your fjord or village, and yet one always constrained by the cold fingers of winter. The sea might offer opportunity, but it never promised safety. And so, by firelight, the Viking world waited for spring, not just to sow the fields again, but to set sail toward the edges of the known world once more. Now picture yourself much smaller, not a farmer or trader, not even a fighter, but a child in the Viking world, wide-eyed, barefoot, and wrapped in hand-me-down wool that barely fits. Life did not pause for youth in this harsh climate. From a very young age, Your world was filled with tasks and expectations. You helped gather kindling, you fed the livestock, you listened carefully to the quiet commands of your mother and the wary instructions of your father. There were no schools, no formal lessons beyond what you observed and mimicked. You learned by doing, or not at all. Play existed, of course. Games with bones, carved toys, snow fights, but always in the margins of responsibility. If you were a boy, you'd eventually be given a small knife, not just as a tool, but as a symbol that you were expected to start pulling your weight. If a girl, you might be taught to spin thread or to help with salting meat by the time your hands could. Hold a pot steady. The rhythm of childhood was survival, skill, and slowly absorbing the stories of your people, not from books, but from the mouths of elders as they repaired fishing nets or stirred thick stews in iron pots. There was laughter and song, and the strange joy that came from rare days of sunshine or catching your first fish. But winters were long and dark, and even children felt the weight of hunger and illness. A cough could become something more. Fevers were feared. Healing came from herbs, charms, or experience, not certainty. Some children did not live to see their names carved in stone. The sagas are filled with adult triumphs, but the lives of children passed quietly, shaped not by grand events but by chores, cold and the ever-present nearness of kin. Yet within these constraints, identity was formed. You learned what it meant to be brave, not in battle, but in holding still while frost was scraped from your sleeves. You learned what loyalty meant, not in speeches, but in carrying wood for your aging grandfather or watching your siblings while your parents mended the roof. Childhood was not sheltered. It was the slow process of becoming, of learning how to belong to a people who saw the world through myth, memory, and endurance. So, stories mattered. You listened to tales of Thor's hammer, of Odin's sacrifice, of the wolf that would one day swallow the sun. These were not bedtime stories for comfort. They were tools, ways of understanding cold, fear, and uncertainty. They explained why life was hard, but also why you must keep going. Children grew up knowing they were part of something ancient, cyclical, and often harsh. And they learned early on that the land gave nothing for free. In winter, you stayed close to the fire, watched the adults sharpen tools, and helped with what you could. You knew the feel of rough wood, the itch of unwashed wool, and the sound of the wind clawing at the thatch above your head. This was not a childhood of soft things. It was one of memory, patience, and learning how to find light in a world that often seemed made of stone and snow. And somehow, even in the silence of winter, children laughed, ran, and dreamed, just as they always have, even in the coldest corners of history. As we reach the quiet close of this journey, imagine now the dark stillness of midwinter, the air outside brittle and breathless, the ground locked beneath ice, and the sky offering neither warmth nor color. In these longest nights, the Vikings turned inward, not only into their homes, but into their myths. You would sit near the hearth, wrapped in furs, your fingers sticky from dried berries or warm broth, while the old stories were spoken again, not as entertainment, but as reminders of a larger unseen world. Winter was not just a season, it was a threshold, a time when the veil between gods and men thinned. Odin, the All-Father, was said to wander during Yule, a ghostly hunter across the sky. Children might leave offerings, simple bread, bits of fat, carved tokens, in hopes of protection. The wild hunt was feared in these nights, a procession of spirits riding wind and cloud, best avoided by staying close to firelight and kin. The festival of Yule, Jol in Old Norse, lasted several days, marked by feasting, sacrifice, and signs that the sun would eventually return. Evergreen boughs, symbolizing life and death, were brought indoors. Fires were stoked high, not only for warmth, but to mimic the returning light. You might slaughter a pig, pour mead to the gods, or carve runes for guidance. There was reverence but also release, the promise that this frozen world would not hold forever. Some of these rituals feel familiar even now. The 12 days of Yule, the tree in the hall, the feast at the darkest hour. But for the Vikings, these weren't quaint traditions. They were vital, a spiritual strategy to survive the coldest nights with hope. To remind themselves that even the snow-covered earth had not forgotten spring, that the sun, though absent, still circled above the clouds, waiting to return. Death and renewal lived close together in the Viking calendar. And midwinter was their axis. You might consult a seeress for the year to come, or dream of Ragnarok, the end of all things, when even the gods would fall. But for now, in this frozen season, you gave thanks for survival. For one more winter, endured. For one more story remembered. It was not a time of certainty, but of faith, not in dogma, but in rhythm. The rhythm of the land, of shadow and light, of struggle and rest. And so the people waited, not idly, but deliberately. They tended fires, spoke of giants and stars, honored their dead, and listened to the creak of the timbered roof as the wind curled outside. They understood, in ways we've perhaps forgotten, that winter wasn't just weather. It was a sacred pause, a reckoning, a test of both body and spirit. And in that hush between storms, in the flicker of torchlight, the Vikings kept their world alive, one long, cold night at a time.